It's very difficult to say. Trump is Trump, and I don't think even the people working around him know what he's going to say tomorrow. And I think probably Trump himself doesn't really have a vision of the future or any strategy when it comes to both politics at home as well as politics abroad. We're seeing how the United States under Trump, uh, with regards to Ukraine, has shifted. And even the rhetoric has shifted and US policy has shifted. Trump, when he came to power, he could have brought the war to an end. He had the political momentum. He chose not to do so. Now he's increasingly looking like Biden, at least for the time being. Uh, in with regards to Gaza, he uh, pushed for a ceasefire. Witkoff negotiated a ceasefire. We were told that Netanyahu was read the riot act, and then literally days later, Trump himself tore up the deal and said that Palestinians must leave Gaza. They must be ethnically cleansed. And then he, of course, gave the green light for the renewal of the genocide and the starvation siege. So it's very hard to imagine a a path forward because Trump is always changing his stance. We suddenly wake up to something on Truth Social and all the calculations that were made change. You speak about something on one of your shows, and then literally while you're when the show finishes, you see that things have changed. That's how it is now. When you said at the beginning of the show that it's been a while that I've been on and things have changed, if I was on a couple of days ago, things would have still have been very different. Uh, during these 48 hours. It's, these are the trade war itself, another, I think, sign that, or another instance where Trump is unpredictable and he doesn't really have a strategy. He may have a vision of sorts sometimes, but for example, with regards to the trade war, but how it's carried out indicates that there's no real strategy. And then when it comes to Iran, let's look at two cases. One is Witkoff. He retweeted what the U.S. Secretary of State, his threat against Iran that he made on Twitter couple of weeks ago, where he basically said we're going to hit Iran or punish Iran. Uh, it was more than a threat. He by retweeting that, I think either he like Trump is exposing a, a qualities that uh, that are not useful for any negotiations, any meaningful negotiations. And then we have his interview that he just carried out with Breitbart, I think. I haven't seen the interview. I've seen a Persian translation of it. But in that interview, he basically moved away from uh, the issue of military, preventing some sort of military move towards a nuclear weapon to demanding the complete removal of all of Iran's centrifuges and an end to enrichment altogether. That is something that's unacceptable to Iran. And so it seems like the US is now moving the goalposts from appearances, at least from what we see in the media. Now, what will happen on Saturday, I don't know. But it's possible that right after Trump ends his tour of the region, that he may say that he may publish something on Truth Social and say that negotiations are meaningless, the Iranians are a threat, and whatever. But we don't know where it's going to go. But I think, uh, and also something that's not been said much in the media is that during this period of negotiations, the United States has constantly been increasing sanctions. So there's no goodwill. There's no indication that the United States is moving the goalposts. They're also, there's always this threat of war, which we don't take seriously. There's a possibility that the United States would strike Iran, but Iran would strike back hard. But war would mean that the United States would have to bring 1.5 million soldiers to the region. They don't even have that capability. This is not the 1990s. The world has changed, and the United States doesn't have those capabilities. It's because of its endless wars and its mismanagement. It's just not. It's not on the table. There's that option is no longer on the table, whether they say it is or not. But in any case, the threat of war, constantly increasing sanctions, moving the goalposts, these are not good signs.
Yeah, I thought that the acceptance of defeat in Yemen, and let's call it a defeat, coupled with some sort of opening up towards negotiation. Of course, as you said, that Wittkopf said that there should be no enrichment at all, and all nuclear facilities, not just not having centrifuges, but even all nuclear materials would have to be de-enriched, let's say, is of course not acceptable, and that's not part of the framework we were assuming is the framework under which the talks are going on. But I at least thought that they've realized that the war option is off the table, because if you couldn't do it in Yemen, that is indirectly accepting that that is out of option in Iran. We'll keep some of these in our minds, but if I can ask you about, as you said, President Trump's much hyped visit to the Middle East in the mid-May. I mean, I personally think that it is more about billions of dollars of contracts by Qataris to about buying Boeing aircraft, hundreds of billions of dollars of investments from Saudi Arabia, and all the AI agreements and so on from UAE, because clearly, the tariffs and the trade embargo with China has boomerang on the US economy, and he has to show something that the economy should be doing fine, and so he needs this. So I personally feel that it would be a much high publicities about these trade agreements, which have happened already behind closed doors, but it would be a big media fanfare. But that apart, I think there is an Iran angle to it as the talks are going on. I My question to you is, what is the attitude of the Saudis? Because Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi have preceded the fourth round of talks by visiting both Saudi Arabia and is it Qatar? Yes.
That's right.
Yes. So, do you think that the Saudis in particular would have some leverage in pushing the Americans for normalizations with Iran?
Without a doubt, the mood in the Persian Gulf has changed. There's no doubt about that. The Saudis, the Emiratis, in the past, according to WikiLeaks, we know that they were actually egging on the United States. They were calling on the United States to attack Iran, cut off the head of the snake, and that sort of thing. But now, as we've seen through, for example, the trip of the defense minister of Saudi Arabia to Tehran, and the fact that he sent a message from the king, King Salman, I think it shows that countries in the Persian Gulf, these tiny regimes that are completely dependent on oil, but also Saudi Arabia, which is also almost completely dependent on oil, and of course the Qataris on gas, that these regimes know that if the United States attacks Iran, it would be horrible for them. And it could end, depending on the type of attack, it could end with the destruction of all of these regimes. And I think that they recognize Now, Iran's drone and missile capability would leave them all destroyed if they were targeted. And we have to remember that the Americans have bases in all of these entities, in all of these countries, in Qatar and Bahrain, in the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. So none of them can pretend that they are uh, neutral in when the United States, if the United States attacks Iran. So that has changed, and they would probably be pushing the United States away from uh, some sort of military conflict. But it would still be very difficult for the United States to attack Iran. The only two, I mean, if they use bases in the Persian Gulf region, that would end those regimes. But let's say the United States flew over Iraq. Well, the Israelis tried that, and Iranian air defenses were so good that the Israelis never even came close to Iranian airspace. They stayed a good 100 kilometers away when they fired missiles. And missiles are not going to have that sort of effect, missiles fired from jets, because the payload is small. And then if the Americans fly over Iraq, that would cause a reaction inside Iraq itself. And so that's not a really realistic option. The only thing left would be Diego Garcia. And from there to central Iran, it would be a one-way trip would be 5,000 kilometers. And B-2s and B-52s would be very vulnerable. So the Americans don't have any good options. But I agree with you that countries in the region, their mood has shifted. And I think that the Iranian foreign minister's trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar is a reinforcement of that. Trump's trip to the region, I think, is mostly about money, but I don't really take it that seriously. Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates put all their money in the West. They are in Western banks. They are constantly being milked by the West. Qatar is always being milked, and the regime in Qatar is, they give all these companies that do construction work. We saw this for example, in the World Cup, which by some estimates it costed, well, a huge amount of money. I don't want to say, I may be wrong. And then now all those hotels are empty, all those stadiums are empty, the airport is empty, the underground is empty. They just give it to Western contractors and businesses linked to Western politicians and American senators and so on, just so that they can keep their thrones. That's basically it. So I don't think Trump is going to gain much from these trips because all their extra money is in Western banks, and a lot of their money is being wasted on NEOM and these crazy projects, mega projects that I'm afraid will ultimately be like a black hole.
So with that very cautious, at least let's not call it conclusion, but with that cautious analysis that the Gulf monarchs, the countries in these regions would probably dissuade the United States from attacking Iran, given they would fear huge destabilizing impact over and above the economic impact. I mean, in places like Bahrain would be remarkably vulnerable because of their internal demography, for instance. But then the question comes is, what is the future of relationship between Iran and these countries? Because they surely want to contain Iran. They don't want to see Iran as a power in the region. They don't want to see Iran. They don't want to see Iran as an alternative to their power and influence in the region, whether it's economically, militarily, geopolitically, culturally. Walk us through what these normalizations between Saudi Arabia and Iran mean in reality.
Well, the demographics in the Emirates or in Qatar or elsewhere are not any better than Bahrain. If you know, the Emirates has a passport holding population of a little over 1 million. if there was conflict and Iran struck key Emirati assets, the indentured servants would take over the country. The regime would fall very swiftly. The same is true in Qatar. I mean, none of these are real countries. These are, they have a lot of oil. Under certain circumstances, they've been able to build these cities, these giant city shopping malls, but they're not inherently powerful. You see, they're not like, I don't know, Iran or Pakistan or India or Indonesia or anything like that. They're tiny and they're extremely vulnerable. They, of course, uh, started off on with aggression towards Iran from the beginning of the revolution. They supported Saddam Hussein. They financed his war. They're responsible for the deaths of uh, all of those people who were killed on the Iranian side in the Iran-Iraq War. The martyrs. They have these regimes have blood on their hands. Uh, they use intelligence gathering, they use AWACS, they provided huge amounts of money. And but after the war, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Iran gave refuge to the Kuwaitis, and Iran also condemned Saddam's aggression. And we had rapprochement, and Iran facilitated rapprochement. And ultimately, Crown Prince Abdullah, who later became the king, he traveled to Tehran for the conference of Islamic leaders. So the Iranians are always willing to have better ties, but what the United States has done is it has conditioned many entities across the region to keep a distance from Iran. It's always been a policy of divide and rule for the West, and they have to a large degree been successful. Now, I think these countries recognize that the United States is no longer what it used to be. It doesn't have the strength that it had before. And therefore, they are changing their policies. Perhaps the Emiratis are the most resistant to change, but the others are increasingly recognizing that the United States does not hold that sort of authority that it had before. And they are seeking better ties with Iran, which is fine. For the Iranians, they always wanted normal ties, and that is why the foreign minister did travel to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Also, you see that these countries in the Persian Gulf, they are improving their relations with the Russians, with the Chinese, and I think it's because of they recognize a shift taking place in the global balance of power. Not that the United States is still not the most influential entity on the other side of the Persian Gulf. It is because these family dictatorships, their children, their grandchildren, they all study in the West. They travel to the West for vacation. They are closely bound to the West. But the world is changing, and I think they recognize it. The very fact that 10, 15 years ago they were calling for attacks on Iran and to undermine Iran completely, and now they're saying something completely different, I think reflects that.
I think I want to ask you a little bit about Iran's approach to the West and the rest of the globe, given within the three things that are discussed within the US Iran talks, as I understand, the sanctions, the Iranians allowing international inspectors to inspect their nuclear sites. And then the most contentious question is probably the enrichment level, right? I want to ask you a little bit about sanctions and the realignments of the global economy. Given Iran has been sanctioned so heavily, it of course it wants to get out of that and build some contact with the West. That's very, very clear. That is necessary. But then it also raises the question that a lot of others in the global south are thinking that maybe we have to think about other alternatives than the United States, because they are unilaterally upending the WTO order. They are unilaterally upending the global order in general. So we are being more vulnerable by being dependent on the West. So maybe we should build more South-South collaboration. Uh, to that extent, what do you think is the Iranian strategy insofar as, assuming if the talks go as they would like, there would be some normalization with the West, but then they must also be thinking about further consolidating their relationship with China, with India, in Russia, which has deepened over the years?
There's no doubt that Iran is moving in that direction. Iran is prioritizing its ties with the global south, with powers like China, Russia, India, among others. Iran would like to decrease tensions with Western countries and, if possible, take advantage of the splits that have now emerged in the West, regardless of how deep these splits really are, or how sustainable they are for in our case, or how effective they are when it comes to relations with Iran. But Iran would like to have better relations, and that's why Iran negotiates. But I have no doubt that Iran will continue, regardless of whether there's an agreement or not, Iran will continue to expand ties with its friends and with regional countries. We've been talking about countries in the Persian Gulf. Relations are better. The business and trade environment has improved, but it's also true for Central Asian countries. Iran's relations are expanding with the Caucasus. So today, Iran is much less dependent on the West, and that's why the sanctions regime is not having the sort of effect that it had before. It still has an impact. It's still significant. It's still hurtful for ordinary Iranians because the West is targeting ordinary Iranians. In the past, it used to be very difficult for people to recognize how the West is targeting innocent people. But after Gaza and the Holocaust that we've seen there, the genocide and the daily targeting of children and women, and the support that the West gives, the unconditional support that the West gives to the Israeli regime, I think for everyone now it's clear what Western civilization really means. But in any case, the sanctions are decreasing in importance, and Iran will continue to move in a direction to decrease its vulnerability to Western financial institutions and to the dollar. And now that Russia has joined the club of sanctioned countries, and now that China is being increasingly targeted by the United States, relations between Iran, Russia, and China are evolving very swiftly. And I think that will that will increase the pace of for countries to form new mechanisms for business and trade which circumvent the dollar and Western financial institutions. So ironically, the war in Ukraine has strengthened Iran because it has pushed Russia towards Iran and it has weakened the West. And the tariff war on the world has isolated the United States, thus strengthening Iran. And in the case of China, which is being heavily targeted by the United States, it has also had a major impact on the Iranian-Chinese relationship. And now, around now is the anniversary of President Raisi's demise. Under his presidency, Iran joined as you know, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then it joined BRICS. So the circumstances are changing very fast. And I think that the United States is overstretched. It is tired. People are tired of these endless wars. So I think that the U.S. capabilities in hurting Iran are decreasing. Even if there is a strike on Iran, it will be a limited strike. As I said earlier, they can't wage a war against the country. But if there's a strike on Iran, Iran's ability to hurt the U.S. and to target not just its military across the region, but its interests across the region, which go beyond military, is much greater. The U.S. is much more vulnerable to Iran than Iran is to the United States, because Iran has over 300 underground bases across the country. It has precision guided drones and missiles. I think it's obvious that in the region, Iran is number one, and probably in the world, it's among the three, four best when it comes to missiles and drones. I think the Russians will confirm that. So that makes the U.S. vulnerable, and this is Iranian turf. This is Iran's land. It's Iran's neighborhood, so it would be much more expensive for the Americans to engage in conflict. And we have all those glass palaces in the Persian Gulf region, so which that makes it very difficult for the United States to engage in any major conflict with Iran.
In this age of war, military technology have been so much marketed so that they can be exported. I mean, part of the reason why Israel constantly pummels Gaza is because it wants to showcase to the buyers of the world how effective our drones are. But on a very different note, while this market has been dominated by the French and the Russians and the Americans and increasingly Chinese, we hear about the efficacy of Iranian drones in the recent war in Ukraine.
Missiles,
Missiles, yes, yes, that's true.
drones
Um,
and missiles.
eh, um, I want to shift to Yemen, and I want to discuss two set of things, and maybe we'll end with Israel. But before Israel, I think there are the other dimension of the Yemen. The U.S. Accepting the ceasefire on May 6th with Ansar Allah says that it accepts that either it is incapable or non-interested in changing the status quo in the region, because this is something that is not often discussed. Ever since the indiscriminate bombing of Yemen started under President Trump, a lot of foreign affairs articles and the pundits in the West began immediately talking about a ground offensive led by the IRG, the internationally recognized governance, so-called, so that the Houthis would be toppled. So it's not just about containing the Houthis from shelling in the Red Sea and Bab al-Manda, but it's also a regime change. And certainly the Saudis and the Emiratis, which are so key to this civil war, they must have said no. And that's why the Omanians could negotiate this ceasefire. Isn't this a direct acceptance that Ansar Allah is going to stay there, and that also means that one has to recognize that all these talks about the weakening of axis of resistance with the fall of Damascus, and to some extent the weakening of Hezbollah, even though one can debate about that, the axis of resistance isn't over, geopolitically speaking.
By no means. Yes, you're absolutely correct. What happened in Yemen was a major victory for the axis of resistance. And Ansar Allah, it forced the United States to reverse Trump's words, to capitulate. Because what we saw was a capitulation on the American side. The Americans they said, we will, Ansar Allah will no longer hit our ships, and we will no longer strike out at Ansar Allah. But that's what it was before Trump began this conflict. Ansar Allah was never targeting anyone's ships. They said the Red Sea is closed to Israeli-linked ships because the Israeli regime restarted the starvation siege. And that was even before the genocidal attacks were renewed. First, Israel and Netanyahu, they restarted the siege, and that's when Ansar Allah gave them 4 or 5 days to end the starvation siege, and then after that they closed the Red Sea again. The reason why the Red Sea is closed to shipping right now is because the United States started a war in the Red Sea And so insurance companies, they become the rates that they are demanding are so high that no ship is going to sail through. So Trump basically capitulated. And that is, of course, something that you're not going to see in the Western media because it runs against the narrative of a weakened axis of resistance. And it also shows, going back sort of to what we we're discussing earlier, that if the United States attacks Iran, it's going to be infinitely worse for the United States. They could not destroy Yemen's underground missile and drone capabilities by their own admission. I think it was the Wall Street Journal that first admitted this. How are they going to deal with Iran, which is infinitely more powerful and which has so many U.S. assets and surrounding it, and where all these glass palaces and castles are nearby just across the Persian Gulf region? So that's a major defeat. And also, with regards to the weakening of Hezbollah, I would point out that in war, everyone is weakened. But so are the Israelis. The Israeli economy is much weakened. The Israeli military is much weakened. The divisions inside Israel are much greater. And many people are talking about civil war inside Israel between the Ashkenazi Jews and the fanatical Zionist religious Jews that are on the rise. Both are genocidal, both are racist, but they have differing worldviews about what Israel means to them. But most importantly, or just as important, is the fact that the Israeli regime has become despised across the world, and even in the West, public opinion is turning against it. Look at Friedman, who I have no respect for, but his article in the New York Times reflects this changing reality in the West, where young people especially are turning against Zionism and against ethno-supremacism and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide in Palestine. So the circumstances are not good for the United States. They're not good for the Israeli regime. And I would add one final point, and that is Syria. Syria, as I said earlier to you after the fall of Syria, and I think that what I was saying back then has been confirmed. The fall of Syria is, I mean, the misery of and the slaughter of ISIS and Al Qaeda, of minorities aside, the slaughter of the Alawites, of the Druze, of the Kurds, all of that, the demonization of the Christians and the killing of the Christians, all of that aside.
Even Sunnis who don't agree.
Even Sunnis, yes, Sufi Sunnis, moderate Sunnis, secular Sunnis, everyone is targeted by these maniacs, by these Takfiri terrorists. Jolani was a deputy of ISIS, and now he's in Paris, where his ISIS has gone home ultimately. But what has happened in Syria is that those because the United States and the West, as I said earlier, they use divide and rule policies. They were able to, through media, through these Arab dictatorships, whether in oil rich or gas rich, they were able to make create a divide in the region, to antagonize Iran and the resistance over Syria, to use sectarianism and racism during the dirty war in Syria to create this divide. And Western media, of course, had the same narrative, but they pursued it in a different way to antagonize Iran. But now, I think it's clear, many Sunnis across the region, friends of mine, and people outside of the region in the West, Westerners now understand that Iran was right, that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was right, that what was happening, the dirty war in Syria, Operation Timber Sycamore, where Al Qaeda was on America's side, as Jake Sullivan admitted early on February the 12th, 2012. People are waking up to this reality. People see that Iran was right. The axis of resistance is right. Erdogan, Qatar, the King of Jordan, Israel, NATO, they were all conspiring to destroy Syria in the interest of the West. Erdogan, of course, wanted his piece of the cake, and Qatar wanted its piece of the cake, but ultimately, the United States does not carry out dirty wars for the sake of the people of the region. They were doing it for the sake of Israel. That's why they wanted, after 9/11, they decided to carry out 7 wars. All of these wars, as we know, were carried out for the sake of for the Israeli regime. Netanyahu was pushing for them, as recently many intellectuals and pundits and others have been pointing out.
One element that struck me about the ceasefire was that there was no clause about bombing Israeli ship or Israeli bound ship or even bombing Israel, right? And given we know so much about the Israeli lobby's influence on the United States, I mean, it's striking that the United States could bypass them and just run away from Yemen, probably because it was costing them too much. But this definitely Donald Trump's costliest warfare from which he has run away. Now, I think in his right sense of mind, but the important thing is that there is no ceasefire between Israel and Yemen. Which means that the Yemeni position is continuous, and we are seeing these escalations, missiles fallen on the Ben Gurion airport, and Israeli missiles fired back at the capital city of Sana'a, its airport, but also factories at the port city of Hadaidah, and so on. I don't know, what does it reflect to you?
Well, first and foremost, I think what is clear is that the West has been fully exposed, not just in Gaza, not just through the genocidal strikes in Lebanon. Remember, in Lebanon, when the Israelis launched its attack, where they failed against Hezbollah because they couldn't take any of the towns and cities, and they were going to go to the river, they still failed. And after what they did in Syria, and they've kept bombing Syria and destroying Syria and all of the country's infrastructure. So, when Mr. when the when they were people were Western backed terrorists and their regional allies were saying that everything in Syria will be fine after the fall of President Assad, we saw the opposite happen. The Israelis went and destroyed everything, even though Jolani has been literally on his knees trying to find common ground with the Israelis, and he looks increasingly like a King Hussein of Jordan rather than a man of, well, he never was a man of resistance, but he was always a CIA asset. But
And despite having Turkey's back, Israel is being relentless, despite Sarah
of,
having Turkey's back.
of course, because Erdogan is in the NATO camp. He's only a strong leader when he's bullying uh, people in the region or around him. Otherwise, when Trump, if you recall, when Trump threatened to sanction Turkey or sanctioned Turkey very briefly over that American pastor, he bowed immediately. He submitted to the United States immediately. So the parallel relationship between Erdogan and Washington is clear. But in any case, what has happened in Syria has vindicated Hezbollah. It has shown that Hezbollah must have military capabilities to resist the Israeli regime. Otherwise, if Hezbollah is disarmed, the fate of Lebanon will be just like Syria. And we saw just a few days ago in the local elections in Lebanon, Hezbollah won every seat that it contested, every single seat. So it shows the stature of Hezbollah after the war, contrary to the sort of the media narrative of the West or these Arab dictatorships which are bound to the West. So, in the way I see it is that not Syria, the events in Syria have vindicated Hezbollah. They not only do they justify Hezbollah keep preserving its arms, but Hezbollah will be strengthened. And it also discredits all those people who supported regime change. They were all doing a service to the Israeli regime and undermining the Palestinian cause, wittingly or otherwise. Some, I'm sure, many, I'm sure, unwittingly. But many have woken up to this, and this strengthens the resistance. The resistance today is you see those sectarian and religious divides that they were and racial divides that the West and their local proxies were using. They are much diminished, and Ansarullah plays a huge role in this. Ansarullah, Hezbollah, all of these entities that are fighting for people in Palestine who are Sunni. It has destroyed this narrative of divide and rule. This narrative promoted to create to divide and rule the region. It's destroyed that narrative. So when the Israeli regime bombs Ansarullah, when it doesn't bomb Ansarullah, it only bombs civilian targets. They're exclusively civilian targets that the Israelis and the Americans that the Israelis have bombed. The Americans have mostly been bombing civilian targets, and the military targets that they sought, they failed in destroying them. They were all deep underground. So they went and bombed apartment buildings, gas stations, ports, factories. But by doing this, they discredit themselves further. They expose themselves to the international community as being barbaric and backward, whether the Israeli regime or the Americans. The same was true in Lebanon. When they bombed Lebanon, when they slaughtered women and children, Western journalists in Beirut were, even though their fixers were Lebanese, their drivers were Lebanese, their producers were Lebanese, they were constantly said, these are Hezbollah strongholds. They knew that these were the homes of ordinary people, but they were apologists for this genocidal regime because they are simply pawns, and the Western media is basically a tool of Western powers. All of these facts in a changing world where Western media no longer rules, where Western powers no longer have overwhelming power, all of these are bringing about rapid change. They're bringing about rapid change in public opinion. They're bringing about a rapid change on the battlefield, and they're helping bring about change in the way in which politics takes place and how politics works in this region. So the United States is doing everything wrong. They are their own worst enemy. They're acting as a catalyst to undermine themselves, just like the war in Ukraine, just like the endless wars, just like the tariff war. All of these, especially as they happen simultaneously, and the barbaric attacks on Yemen, Gaza, of course, Lebanon, Syria, all of these are undermining the West. They think that they're scoring points, but they're doing the exact opposite. They're making their enemies the West. It makes their enemies look civilized. They make their enemies look reasonable. They make their enemies look sane in the process of carrying out these atrocities and justifying it through Western media and through statements made by governments in Western capitals.
I want to end by quickly asking you one last question about Western media, related to my question on Gaza, because as we are focusing on all these developments and a lot is going on in India and Pakistan, on which we would have two more shows immediately after this one with Professor Taimur Rahman from Pakistan, the other with Vijay Prashad. My sense is that the Gaza question, particularly in the United States, has been pushed out of sight to a significant degree. And what we saw was that the opposition to Israeli genocide in the United States came primarily from the young university section who were appalled by this. And there are multiple surveys, but one Brookings institution said that overwhelming people within universities now think that this is appalling. But it seems to me that the fact that Netanyahu has been able to kill 50 people on a daily basis ever since the ceasefire was broken, there is a big role in Western media about now completely pushing this out of sight in what's happening in Gaza. I mean, part of this seems to me is because the United States is overwhelmed by its domestic issues. I mean, attacks on universities, on immigrations, on law firms, impacts on trade and tariffs, its capital markets, bond deals going up, war, Ukraine negotiations. I mean, you name it. There are just so many. But I do fear when we are talking about this upswing in global consensus about opposition to genocide. Do you think that in the United States there is a backsliding, whether it's out of fear, people have stopped talking about it, or whether it's a deliberate policy? We haven't seen Western media keeping up the pressures on its ruling elites.
I have direct contact with many Western journalists, and in their private conversations with me on my cell phone, written, they admit that Western media, well, they would be very careful in their wording, but they would admit they're doing not nearly enough. I tell them they're doing nothing, and I think they know that. Uh, this is systematic. Remember, the media is 93% of American media is controlled by three corporations. All of these corporations are interlinked with the state. The real power is with the corporations, not the state.
You,
The
you
Democrats and
remind
the Republicans.
you remind me of Harman and Chomsky's opening chapters on manufacturing consent. They start with that.
Yes, that was yes, when we used in our youth when we read these books. Now, if anyone goes and reads that book, they would see how outdated it is because things are so more clear and so more obvious today than they were back then, especially when during the Clinton years they uh, they removed all of the laws which allowed for these monopolies to grow. And so that book was written well before the Clinton years. But in any case, and the results of the Clinton years, what I think is happening is that the West is discrediting this, just as I was saying earlier, that the West has discredited itself across the world. It has exposed liberalism to be authoritarian, brutal, barbaric, and ruthless and genocidal. But they're also exposing themselves at home by crushing student protests, by arresting people in Europe and the UK, by arresting journalists who are protesting or reporting on a genocide taking place in another part of the world. They're not even talking about some local event, but they're being silenced. And the laws that are being contemplated, the way in which the Secret Service, well, the FBI and other agencies are being weaponized against their own citizens. This is only making things worse for the Israeli regime. It's making it worse for the neocons and Zionists because people recognize what's happening. So this clamping down at home in the West is also a catalyst that's on. In other words, they are doing everything wrong abroad and they're doing everything wrong at home simultaneously. And I think that is a sign of a declining empire. A declining empire becomes increasingly desperate and therefore irrational. When when someone is drowning, They say you should never, if you want to save that person, of course, you should not approach it from the front. Should go to the back and try to save it because that person, out of desperation, yes, will claw at you and probably drown you too. Now, the Western Empire we should allow to drown, but I mean, I'm talking about ordinary people. The empire is desperate, and there it's just clawing and it's behaving in a desperate manner and thus harming itself more than ever before and this is acting as a catalyst to bring down the empire more swiftly. But there's no doubt that they are censoring Gaza. There's no doubt that you the slaughter of tens of people every day on average in Gaza should be the top news around the world, especially when it's done in the name of racism. It's when they are Amalek, according to the Israelis. When the Israelis have shown that they intend genocide, it's just unbelievable that the racism that we see today is so open and it's so what the British did in India, in your country, is horrific. But in a way, this is far worse because in India, people across the world weren't watching it. Maybe the numbers were far greater. The famine and the subjugation and the humiliation and the murders, the numbers were far greater, but never before in any conflict in human history or in any act of racism and subjugation was it carried out in front of the eyes of the world, and never did we see the West and Western governments and Western media justify this disgrace and to present it as something that is necessary and to present those who are perpetrating this genocide as civilized. We've never seen that before. We people in Iran who lived in the land that's now Iran, that's called Iran, they didn't know what was happening in India or the subcontinent or in Africa or elsewhere. We lived in a different world. But today, we wake up and we see these scenes every day of beheaded children, bodies ripped apart, dead women whose unborn children are lying beside them. Every single day, this is the sort of thing that we see. The Western media is indeed hiding it because the West is not free, because the West is not democratic, because the West is the regimes are racist and hierarchical and Eurocentric, and this is unforgivable. I thought your final question would be about India and Pakistan, so I just want to make a small point. And
Absolutely, yes.
I believe that this
I just didn't explore that as much since I'm already planning two shows, but it's very
I know.
important to hear an Iranian perspective on what's going on in the subcontinent.
I have no doubt that that there is a hidden hand here, and I believe that attack on tourists, that terror attack on tourists, was a false flag operation. And the defense minister of Pakistan did a very interesting interview on Sky News, as I'm sure you saw. And he said when Sky News was accusing Pakistan, he said, we did your dirty work, meaning the dirty work of the West for 3 decades, which I think was both very revealing, but quite a courageous statement to make. The mess that we see in all these terror groups that are now harming Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Iran, this is all because of the West. They created these terror organizations. They created this mess. And in the 1980s, they used Pakistan, and Pakistan was, as the defense minister said, forced to do basically their dirty work, or did their dirty work back then. I thought it was a courageous statement, and I thought it was also a message to Indians that, no, we have nothing to do with this. And by the way, what Turkey, what Erdogan, and what Qatar, and what these regimes are, what the Qatari regime is doing, and what Erdogan is doing, is identical almost to what Pakistan was doing in the 1980s. And whenever the regime in Qatar is gone, the current regime, or Erdogan is gone, I think one day someone from Ankara will be saying something very similar about the past. These terror groups have been nothing but misery, has brought nothing but misery for anyone, but they are Western tools. By their own admission, we see Jolani in Paris, and he's soon going to be in London. These are Western organizations. So I believe that the war in between that's going on, or the battle that's going on between Pakistan and India, the root cause is in the West. I do not believe Pakistan had anything to do with that terror attack, and I believe that those who benefit, the only beneficiaries of this war, they're not. They do not reside in India and Pakistan. Maybe, of course, some people who want to sell weapons and so on. But that aside, the beneficiaries lie outside. And I think the key beneficiary would be the Israeli regime. They want war across this region. They do not care for Hindus. They do not care for Muslims. They do not care about Christians. They see them all as Amalek. And that is why so many young Jews in the West and across the world, they're struggling against the Israeli regime, and they're at the forefront of the resistance against the Israeli regime, and they are being battered by universities and governments in the West because they are pointing out that the Israeli regime has no respect for Judaism either, because Zionism is doing all of these crimes in the name of Judaism, and many Jews are saying, no, not in my name. But in any case, the Israeli regime, the only, if you look, governments across the world, especially in our region, are saying we should have a ceasefire and peace, but the Israeli regime is being provocative. It wants war. You can see them through the regime's ambassador in India. It wants war. But what happens if war really becomes serious? Both sides will lose. We all know that. We know that there is no victory in a war when both sides have a nuclear weapon. So why is this ambassador pushing for conflict? Why is the regime pushing for conflict? They don't care about dead Indians or Pakistanis. They care about the Zionist supremacist regime and the interests of the racists who rule over and Palestine and subjugate the Palestinians.
Well, we do have a ceasefire between India and Pakistan as it stands, declared by both Indian and Pakistani government. So we do expect things would de-escalate from there. I mean, smaller issues would remain, but a high-level war would hopefully de-escalate. I'm so glad you. I think you placed your finger at the right point about the Pakistani foreign minister's admission about its participation in that radical project starting in 1979, when the Saudi and the US-led project of funding jihadi to topple the communist government in Afghanistan started. We are having Professor...
And to provoke a Soviet invasion.
Of course.
Most people did not know that the objective was to it wasn't the result of the Soviet invasion. It was to provoke a Soviet invasion. Brzezinski gave this plan to Carter. People can find it online. And the intention was to fund these groups, so that the Soviet Union would invade. They wanted to sacrifice Afghanistan.
This was following Vietnam. This was following Vietnam.
So that the Soviet Union would have their own Vietnam. And then they funded the Saudis and the Americans and others. They funded these terror groups in Pakistan. They created a Pakistan and Afghanistan, which had a culture of Sufism and tolerance. It became Salafi and Wahhabi and intolerant and Takfiri. And these terrorist groups began to kill people inside Pakistan. It spread across the region.
Including including the coup in Pakistan, where General Zia-ul-Haq's government, fanatical government, came and replaced probably Pakistan's most exciting left-leaning democratic experiment under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, um, uh, that started a decade and decades of radical experiment that destabilized the region.
So ordinary Indians and ordinary Pakistanis should recognize where the problem really lies. And if India and Pakistan were to have good relations, imagine how it would benefit the rise of Asia. And who does not benefit from the rise of Asia? Who
Absolutely.
benefits from the rise of Asia?